It was early afternoon on June 3, 1998, and ICE 884 Wilhelm Conrad Röntgen was running precisely on schedule as it departed Munich's Hauptbahnhof at 6:47 a.m. The train was one of Deutsche Bahn's flagship intercity express services, representing Germany's pride in engineering excellence and punctuality. The sleek white train with its distinctive red stripe stretched nearly 410 meters along the platform, 14 coaches carrying 287 passengers and crew northbound toward Hamburg. These were Germany's fastest trains, capable of reaching 280 kilometers per hour on dedicated high-speed tracks, cutting travel times dramatically between major cities. For most passengers settling into their seats that morning, this was routine travel: business executives heading to meetings, families visiting relatives, tourists beginning summer vacations. The weather was pleasant, temperatures mild for early June in Bavaria. Inside the air-conditioned coaches, passengers read newspapers, worked on laptops, dozed or watched the German countryside begin to blur past the windows as the train accelerated northward. Everything appeared completely normal, just another routine departure on one of Europe's most advanced railway networks. The ICE train design represented the pinnacle of German engineering when introduced in 1991. These weren't ordinary trains but technological showcases, featuring aerodynamic designs that minimized drag, sophisticated tilting mechanisms that allowed higher speeds through curves, advanced braking systems, climate control throughout, and passenger amenities that rivaled airlines. The trains operated on a mix of specially built high-speed lines and upgraded conventional tracks, reaching maximum speeds of 280 km per hour on the newest sections. Deutsche Bahn marketed them aggressively as the modern, comfortable alternative to air travel for intercity journeys, and they had proven enormously popular with German travelers who appreciated their speed, comfort, and legendary punctuality. The ICE network had expanded rapidly throughout the 1990s, becoming a symbol of reunified Germany's economic strength and technological prowess. But beneath the gleaming exterior and marketing success, a fundamental design decision made years earlier contained the seeds of catastrophe. Traditional train wheels are monoblock designs, solid steel wheels forged as single pieces and mounted directly on axles. This design had proven itself over more than a century of railway operations worldwide. The wheels are heavy, but that mass provides stability. They're rigid, transmitting vibrations and noise into the train body, but they're also essentially indestructible under normal operating conditions. Metal fatigue develops slowly and predictably. Cracks, when they occur, grow gradually and are usually detected during routine inspections long before they become dangerous. German railway engineers, in the late 1980s, believed they could improve on this proven design. Passenger comfort had become a priority as railways competed with airlines and automobiles. The ICE trains were meant to provide a premium experience, and that meant minimizing the noise and vibration that traditional steel wheels transmitted into passenger coaches at high speeds. The solution they developed was elegant in theory: a wheel design they called the resilient wheel, featuring a steel rim, a steel hub, and between them a rubber damping layer that absorbed vibrations and reduced noise transmission. The rubber acted as a cushion, dramatically reducing the harsh vibrations that solid steel wheels created. Initial testing showed remarkable improvements in passenger comfort. Noise levels inside coaches dropped measurably. Vibration was reduced substantially. It seemed like a genuine innovation, an improvement over century-old technology. The resilient wheel design went into production and was installed on many ICE train sets. Starting in the early 1990s, passengers noticed and appreciated the smoother, quieter ride. Railway officials congratulated themselves on the innovation. The design won engineering awards. For several years, everything appeared successful, but what the designers failed to adequately consider, or perhaps underestimated, was how the rubber damping layer would change the wheel's structural behavior under the immense stresses of high-speed operation. A solid monoblock wheel flexes minimally under load. The forces generated by a train traveling at 200 km per hour, the enormous weight pressing down, the lateral forces during curves, the thermal expansion and contraction, are distributed relatively evenly throughout the solid steel structure. The resilient wheel design fundamentally changed this stress distribution. The rubber layer between rim and hub created a flexible joint that allowed the rim to flex independently of the hub. Every time the wheel rotated under load, the rim flexed outward slightly, then flexed back. This flexing occurred thousands of times per kilometer of travel. Each flex cycle, though tiny, created stress concentrations at the inner surface of the rim where it met the rubber damping layer. Metal fatigue is a well-understood phenomenon in engineering. When metal undergoes repeated stress cycles, microscopic cracks develop at points of stress concentration. These cracks grow slowly with each additional stress cycle, spreading through the metal grain by grain. Eventually, the cracks grow large enough that the metal fails catastrophically. The process is predictable and well documented. Engineers design around it by ensuring stress levels stay below the metal's fatigue limit, or by ensuring that inspection intervals are frequent enough to detect growing cracks before they become dangerous. The resilient wheel design created conditions that made metal fatigue almost inevitable, yet the inspection intervals and procedures weren't adjusted to account for this reality. The wheel rims were flexing constantly during operation, creating perfect conditions for fatigue crack initiation. The cracks would start small, invisible without detailed inspection, and grow larger with each kilometer traveled. What made this particularly insidious was that the rubber damping layer partially concealed the rim's inner surface where the fatigue cracks would initiate and grow. A visual inspection, even a careful one, might miss a developing crack hidden behind the rubber layer. ICE 884's wheel number 733, on the left side of coach 1, had been in service for several years and had traveled hundreds of thousands of kilometers. Deep within the steel rim, invisible from outside, a fatigue crack had initiated months or possibly years earlier at a point of stress concentration. With every rotation of the wheel, every kilometer traveled, the crack grew longer, propagating through the steel grain structure. By early June 1998, the crack had grown approximately 8 millimeters long, extending through a substantial portion of the rim's thickness. The wheel was failing, but there were no external signs that maintenance inspectors or train operators would notice during routine checks. The morning of June 3, the wheel was operating on borrowed time, the crack having propagated through enough of the rim's thickness that catastrophic failure was imminent. But the train departed Munich normally. It accelerated to high speed on the dedicated high-speed line south of Augsburg. The wheel rotated thousands of times, the crack opening and closing slightly with each rotation, growing infinitesimally longer each time. At approximately 10:59 a.m., roughly 4 hours into the journey, ICE 884 was traveling at 200 km per hour through the gentle countryside of Lower Saxony, approaching the small town of Eschede, about 60 kilometers north of Hanover. The train was running on conventional track, not the dedicated high-speed line, but 200 km per hour was well within normal operating parameters for this section. Inside the coaches, passengers were reading, working, talking quietly, or looking out at the rural landscape passing by. Then wheel 733's rim failed. The 8mm crack that had been growing for months suddenly propagated through the remaining steel in a fraction of a second. The rim, no longer structurally connected to the hub, detached partially, and began flapping against the track at 200 km per hour. The initial failure created violent vibrations that passengers in coach 1 felt immediately, a harsh shaking that seemed wrong, concerning, but not yet terrifying. What happened next occurred in seconds but would be analyzed frame by frame for years afterward. The detached rim section, still partially attached and rotating at high speed, was struck by track furniture, the various structures along the railway right-of-way. The impacts tore the rim completely free from the wheel. It bounced along the tracks behind the train for several hundred meters, a curved piece of steel weighing approximately 30 kilograms, tumbling and bouncing at high speed. The train continued forward, now with wheel 733 missing its rim entirely, running on just the hub and the mangled remains of the rubber damping layer. This created even more violent vibrations, and passengers throughout coach 1 felt the harsh shaking intensify. Some passengers later reported hearing a loud bang or series of bangs, the sound of metal striking metal at high speed. But the train was still on the tracks, still moving forward at 200 km per hour. What destroyed ICE 884 wasn't the initial wheel failure itself, but what happened next in a cascade of mechanical destruction that demonstrated how a single failure could escalate into complete catastrophe. The detached wheel rim, bouncing along the tracks behind the train, struck a track switch, the movable sections of rail that allow trains to change tracks. The impact damaged the switch mechanism, causing the switch blades to move into an intermediate position, neither fully aligned for the main track, nor fully aligned for the diverging track. Coach 1, and then Coach 2 passed over the damaged switch without derailing, though the passengers felt severe jolting and vibration. But Coach 3, the restaurant car, reached the damaged switch, and the misaligned rail guidance sent the left side wheels off the track at 200 km per hour. The coach was now in a state of partial derailment, with wheels on one side still on the rails and wheels on the other side running along the track bed, plowing through ballast stones at high speed. The physics of a partial derailment at 200 km per hour are violent and destructive. The derailed coach was being twisted by the enormous forces involved, one side still constrained by the rails, the other side free but dragging through ballast and dirt. The coach began to skew, to rotate slightly relative to the track alignment. This rotation pulled the couplings that connected it to Coach 2 ahead and Coach 4 behind. Modern train couplings are designed to be strong, to hold the train together under normal operating stresses, but they're also designed to fail predictably under extraordinary loads rather than transmitting destructive forces throughout the entire train. The coupling between Coach 3 and Coach 4 reached its failure limit and separated. Coach 3, now detached and fully derailed, slewed violently to the left of the track alignment, dragging Coach 4 with it before that coupling also failed. Both coaches were now off the tracks, tumbling and disintegrating as they plowed through the ground at high speed. Coaches 5 through 14, still coupled together, remained on the tracks and continued forward, their drivers and passengers completely unaware yet that the train had just split into pieces behind them. The automatic emergency braking systems hadn't activated because the air brake lines, though separated, hadn't fully depressurized yet. Coaches 1 and 2, at the front of the train with the locomotive, also remained on the tracks initially and continued forward. But they were slowing now, the engineer having felt the violent disturbances and initiated emergency braking, not yet knowing what had happened behind him, but knowing something catastrophic had occurred. Behind them, coaches 3 and 4 were disintegrating. Coach 3, the restaurant car, rolled and broke apart, scattering debris and bodies across a wide area beside the tracks. Passengers inside experienced forces beyond human survivability, were thrown against walls and ceilings, crushed by collapsing structure, or ejected from the fragmenting coach. Coach 4, pulled sideways by Coach 3 before separating, also derailed and rolled, breaking into multiple pieces. But the cascade wasn't finished. The section of train consisting of coaches 5 through 14 was still on the tracks, still traveling at high speed, though now rapidly decelerating as the emergency brakes engaged. They were approaching a road overpass, a simple concrete bridge carrying a minor rural road over the railway tracks. The bridge had been built decades earlier to standard specifications, designed to carry automobile and truck traffic, with vertical supports positioned safely outside the railway clearance envelope. For more than 30 years, thousands of trains had passed safely beneath it. Coach 1, at the front with the locomotive, passed under the bridge successfully. But Coach 2, the first passenger coach, had been damaged by the initial derailment sequence. Its roof had been torn partially upward by some impact or failure, extending above the normal clearance envelope. As Coach 2 entered the bridge at still considerable speed, its damaged roof structure struck the concrete bridge deck. The impact generated forces far exceeding anything the bridge had been designed to withstand. The bridge wasn't designed to resist horizontal impacts from train structures traveling at speed, it was designed to carry static vertical loads from road traffic. The concrete structure absorbed some of the impact energy by cracking and spalling, but it couldn't absorb enough. The bridge supports fractured. In seconds the bridge collapsed. The concrete deck, weighing approximately 300 tons, fell directly onto Coach 2 as it passed beneath. The coach was crushed instantly, compressed from its normal height of about 4 meters down to perhaps 1 meter, with all passengers and crew inside. The force of the falling bridge stopped Coach 2's forward motion abruptly, like hitting an immovable wall at speed. Coaches 5 through 14, still on the tracks behind, had slowed considerably, but were still traveling at perhaps 100 kilometers per hour, when they slammed into the wreckage of Coach 2 and the collapsed bridge. The collision was devastating. Coaches telescoped into each other, structures designed to absorb crashes up to certain speeds, overwhelmed by the forces involved. Metal crumpled, windows shattered. Passengers were thrown forward by deceleration forces, then crushed by collapsing coach structures. Within perhaps 30 seconds from the initial wheel rim failure, ICE 884 had been transformed from an operational high-speed train into a scattered wreckage field, extending almost a kilometer along the railway line. Coaches 3 and 4 lay in pieces beside the track. Coach 2 was buried under 300 tons of bridge concrete. Coaches 5 through 10 were piled against each other, and the collapsed bridge, twisted and crushed. The locomotive and coach 1 had come to rest perhaps 500 meters past the bridge, damaged but relatively intact. Coaches 11 through 14 remained on the tracks behind the main wreckage pile, damaged by the collision forces, but still mostly intact. The immediate aftermath was chaos. Passengers who could move extracted themselves from damaged coaches and wandered in shock beside the tracks. Others were trapped in wreckage, crying for help, injured and unable to escape. Some coaches contained only silence, the occupants killed instantly by the collision forces or the collapsing structures. The disaster had occurred in rural countryside, between small towns, which would complicate rescue operations. The first emergency call reached dispatchers at 11:01 a.m., approximately 2 minutes after the initial failure, from a motorist on the overpass who had felt the bridge shake and seen it collapse. Within minutes, more calls came from mobile phones as passengers who had escaped called for help, their voices panicked and confused, describing a train crash, a collapsed bridge, people trapped and injured. The emergency response system began mobilizing immediately, but responders faced the challenge of reaching a rural location with limited access, and then dealing with a disaster scene, extending nearly a kilometer along an active railway line. The first fire engines arrived within 15 minutes, responding from Eschede and nearby towns. The firefighters encountered a scene unlike anything they had trained for. Railway accidents in Germany were extraordinarily rare, and an accident of this scale was unprecedented in modern times. Multiple train coaches were destroyed or heavily damaged. Some passengers were wandering in shock. Others were trapped in wreckage, visible and calling for help, but unreachable without equipment to cut through steel and concrete. The collapsed bridge had created a massive obstacle in the middle of the wreckage field, with at least one coach completely buried beneath it. The incident command structure was established quickly, following German emergency response protocols. The fire chief from Celle, the nearest significant city, assumed overall command. Police secured the scene and began closing roads. Emergency medical services established triage areas and called for ambulances from throughout Lower Saxony and neighboring regions. Deutsche Bahn dispatched engineering staff and accident investigators. The scale of the response grew rapidly as the magnitude of the disaster became clear. Rescue operations began immediately but faced extraordinary challenges. The wreckage was unstable, with damaged coaches and the partially collapsed bridge threatening to shift and cause secondary casualties among rescuers. Cutting equipment was needed to access trapped passengers, but power tools created risks of fire or explosion if fuel or hydraulic lines had been ruptured. The warm June weather, while making outdoor work easier than in winter, also meant that trapped passengers were at risk of dehydration and heat exhaustion. The first survivors were extracted relatively quickly, passengers who were trapped but accessible, pinned by debris that could be lifted or cut away without disturbing the larger wreckage structure. Each extraction was methodical, rescuers working carefully to stabilize the casualty, treat injuries, and then remove them without causing further harm. Ambulances shuttled between the scene and hospitals in Celle, Hanover, and other cities, carrying injured passengers for treatment. By early afternoon, heavy lifting equipment arrived, including mobile cranes capable of lifting the massive concrete sections from the collapsed bridge, but using such equipment created new risks. Moving large pieces of concrete might shift the wreckage pile, potentially crushing trapped survivors. Engineering assessments were required before each lift. The work proceeded slowly, prioritizing survivor rescue over speed. The coach buried completely beneath the bridge concrete, Coach 2, presented the most difficult challenge. Rescuers knew passengers had been inside when it was crushed, but reaching them required lifting approximately 300 tons of concrete that had settled onto the crushed coach. The concrete had fractured into several large pieces during the collapse, but each piece weighed dozens of tons. Cranes were positioned carefully. Rigging was attached. The first section of bridge deck was lifted slowly, revealing the crushed coach beneath. What rescuers found was devastating. The coach had been compressed to a fraction of its original height. The force of the falling bridge had been so enormous that the coach's structure had collapsed completely. No survival spaces existed. Everyone inside had been killed instantly by the crushing force. Recovery of bodies would take days and require careful dismantling of the wreckage. As rescue operations continued through the afternoon and into the evening, the passenger count was reconciled against the manifest and the casualty count. ICE 884 had departed Munich with 287 people aboard, passengers and crew. As the sun set on June 3, the confirmed casualty count stood at 101 dead and over 100 injured, many seriously. The death toll made this Germany's deadliest railway accident since 1945, and one of the worst high-speed rail disasters in world history. The investigation began even as rescue operations continued, with Deutsche Bahn and Federal Railway investigators arriving to document the scene and begin determining what had caused the disaster. The wreckage field itself told much of the story. The damaged wheel was recovered quickly, lying beside the track several hundred meters south of the main wreckage. The 8mm fatigue crack was visible in the fractured rim. The detached rim was found further along the tracks. The damaged switch mechanism was documented. The sequence of events could be reconstructed from the physical evidence. The wheel design immediately came under intense scrutiny. Had resilient wheels been a fundamental design error? The fatigue crack was unambiguous evidence of metal failure, but was this an isolated incident or a systemic problem? Investigators ordered immediate inspections of all ICE trains using resilient wheels. Those inspections revealed alarming findings. Multiple wheels showed fatigue cracks in various stages of development. Some cracks were small, just beginning, others were advanced, potentially close to failure. The evidence suggested that the Eschede wheel failure wasn't an isolated incident but rather the first catastrophic failure of a design problem that affected many wheels. Deutsche Bahn faced an immediate crisis of public confidence. Their flagship trains, the symbols of German engineering excellence, had a fundamental design flaw that had killed 101 people. The response was swift and comprehensive. Within days, Deutsche Bahn announced that all resilient wheels would be replaced with traditional monoblock wheels on every ICE train. The replacement program would take months and require removing trains from service, disrupting schedules and causing significant financial costs, but passenger safety had to take absolute priority. The investigation expanded beyond just the wheel design to examine the entire chain of decisions and inspections that had failed to prevent the disaster. How had a wheel with an 8mm crack remained in service? Why hadn't inspections detected the developing failure? Were inspection procedures adequate? Were inspection intervals appropriate? Did inspectors have proper training and equipment to detect fatigue cracks in resilient wheels? The findings were damning in several respects. The inspection procedures in use were largely unchanged from those developed for monoblock wheels, where fatigue cracks develop much more slowly and are easier to detect. The procedures didn't adequately account for the hidden nature of cracks in resilient wheels, where the rubber damping layer partially obscured the critical inner surface of the rim. Inspectors weren't equipped with or trained to use advanced non-destructive testing methods, like ultrasonic inspection that could have detected internal cracks. The inspection intervals derived from experience with monoblock wheels were too long for the faster fatigue crack growth in resilient wheels. Furthermore, there had been warning signs that were not adequately heeded. Other countries using similar wheel designs had experienced non-catastrophic failures, where wheel rims had cracked but been detected before complete failure occurred. These incidents had been documented and reported through international railway safety channels, but the implications for German ICE operations had not been fully appreciated or acted upon. In retrospect, Eschede was a predictable and preventable disaster, the inevitable result of using a wheel design that was more susceptible to fatigue cracking without implementing the more rigorous inspection protocols that design required. The legal proceedings following the disaster were complex and prolonged. Criminal investigations examined whether Deutsche Bahn officials, engineers, or maintenance personnel bore criminal responsibility for the deaths. Civil lawsuits sought compensation for victims and their families. The trials became forums for technical debates about engineering decisions, maintenance practices, and corporate responsibility. The criminal trial focused on several Deutsche Bahn employees, including engineers who had been involved in approving the resilient wheel design and maintenance supervisors responsible for inspection programs. Prosecutors argued that these individuals had been negligent in failing to recognize the heightened inspection requirements for resilient wheels, and in failing to respond adequately to warning signs from incidents in other countries.
The defense argued that the wheel design had been approved by German railway regulators, that it met all applicable standards at the time, and that the maintenance personnel had followed established procedures. After years of proceedings, the court ultimately found the defendants not guilty of criminal negligence, concluding that while errors had been made, they didn't rise to the level of criminal culpability under German law. The decision was controversial and disappointing to many victims' families, who felt that someone should be held criminally accountable for decisions that had resulted in 101 deaths. The civil lawsuits were more successful from the victims' perspective. Deutsche Bahn, as a government-owned railway, had substantial resources and ultimately paid significant compensation to victims and families. The amounts varied based on individual circumstances, lost income, medical costs, and pain and suffering, but represented meaningful financial acknowledgement of the harm caused. Beyond the legal proceedings, the disaster had profound effects on railway safety culture in Germany and internationally. The immediate technical response was straightforward: eliminate resilient wheels and return to proven monoblock wheel designs. This happened rapidly across Germany and other countries that had adopted similar designs. But the deeper questions about safety culture, about how warnings are communicated and acted upon, about how new designs are tested and monitored in service, prompted more fundamental changes. Deutsche Bahn implemented comprehensive reforms to its safety management systems. New procedures required that any innovative design that departed from proven technology would be subject to enhanced monitoring during initial service, with more frequent inspections and formal review processes to identify potential problems before they became catastrophic. The company established a dedicated office to monitor international railway safety incidents and ensure that lessons learned elsewhere were properly evaluated and incorporated into German operations. Inspection procedures for all critical components were reviewed and updated, with more emphasis on non-destructive testing methods capable of detecting internal defects. The German Federal Railway Authority (BWR) also underwent reforms, with strengthened authority to mandate safety improvements and more resources devoted to proactive safety oversight rather than just reacting to incidents. The authority began requiring formal safety cases for new technologies, where railway operators had to demonstrate not just that a design met applicable standards, but that they had systematically identified and mitigated all reasonably foreseeable risks. Internationally, the Eschede disaster prompted similar reforms. The European Union's Railway Safety Directive, which had been in development at the time of the disaster, was strengthened with more stringent requirements for safety management systems and common safety standards across member states. International railway organizations updated their guidelines on wheel design and inspection. The disaster became a case study taught in engineering schools worldwide, illustrating how a seemingly small design change could have catastrophic consequences, and how safety-critical systems require conservative approaches and rigorous oversight.
The town of Eschede itself became forever associated with the disaster. The small community of fewer than 5,000 people, suddenly the site of Germany's worst railway accident in modern times. The response from the community was remarkable. Residents opened their homes to survivors and rescue workers. Local businesses provided food, water, and supplies. The town's small emergency services worked alongside professional rescuers from across the region. In the days following the disaster, Eschede became a focal point for national mourning, with residents organizing memorial services and establishing support networks for survivors and victims' families. A memorial was eventually established near the crash site, a quiet place of reflection featuring a sculpture and plaques with the names of the 101 people who died. The memorial is maintained by the town and visited regularly by survivors, families, and railway safety professionals who come to remember the victims and reflect on the lessons of the disaster. Annual memorial services are held on June 3rd, bringing together survivors, families, rescue workers, and officials to commemorate those who died and to reaffirm the commitment to railway safety. For survivors of the disaster, the psychological trauma proved long-lasting and profound. Many developed post-traumatic stress disorder, experiencing flashbacks, nightmares, and severe anxiety. Simple activities like traveling by train became impossible for some, the memories of the disaster too overwhelming. Survivor support groups were established, providing a community of people who understood the trauma and could support each other through the long recovery process. Psychological counseling was made available, though the effectiveness varied, with some survivors recovering substantially while others struggled with symptoms for years or decades. The families of the 101 people who died faced the unique grief of sudden violent loss. Many victims were traveling alone, so families received the news hours after the disaster from police notifications or media reports. The identification of victims was complicated by the severity of the collision forces, requiring dental records and DNA analysis in some cases. Several families waited days or weeks for confirmation. The grief was compounded by the knowledge that the deaths were preventable, that a different wheel design or better inspection procedures would have meant their loved ones would have come home safely from what should have been a routine train journey. The engineering community engaged in extensive soul-searching about the disaster. How had German engineering, world-renowned for precision and reliability, produced a train wheel that failed catastrophically? The analysis revealed uncomfortable truths about innovation and safety. The resilient wheel had been developed with good intentions, seeking to improve passenger comfort through reduced noise and vibration. The design had been analyzed, tested, and certified according to applicable standards. Yet it had contained a fundamental vulnerability that wasn't adequately understood or monitored. The lesson was that innovation in safety-critical systems requires not just meeting standards but deeply understanding how designs will behave across their entire service life, including how they might fail. The disaster also highlighted the importance of learning from near misses and incidents in other systems. The warning signs had been there, in the form of non-catastrophic wheel failures in other countries, but the signals hadn't prompted adequate response. Modern safety management emphasizes this lesson, that organizations must actively seek out and learn from incidents and near misses in their own operations and in analogous systems elsewhere, treating them as opportunities to prevent future disasters rather than as isolated events. From a technical standpoint, the return to monoblock wheels solved the immediate problem, but represented a step backward in passenger comfort. The harsh vibrations and noise that resilient wheels had successfully reduced returned with traditional solid steel wheels. This prompted renewed research into alternative approaches to vibration reduction that wouldn't compromise structural integrity. Modern high-speed trains use various methods including sophisticated suspension systems, careful track geometry, and acoustic treatments within coaches to achieve comfort without relying on wheel flexibility. The economics of the disaster were substantial. Deutsche Bahn spent hundreds of millions of euros on the wheel replacement program, accident compensation and safety system improvements. There were indirect costs in lost ridership as public confidence in train safety declined temporarily. The broader economic impact on the German railway industry and German engineering reputation was harder to quantify but certainly negative in the years immediately following the disaster. Over time, the comprehensive response and reforms helped restore confidence, demonstrating that the lessons had been learned and acted upon. The Eschede disaster intersected with a broader trend in railway safety that continues today. As trains have gotten faster, the consequences of failures have become more severe. A derailment at 50 km per hour might result in injuries but rarely deaths. The same failure at 200 km per hour can be catastrophic. This reality has driven increasingly conservative approaches to safety-critical components in high-speed rail. Designs must not just meet performance requirements but must fail safely, with multiple layers of protection ensuring that single component failures don't cascade into disasters. The investigation's final report, released nearly 2 years after the disaster, ran to hundreds of pages and contained dozens of recommendations. The core finding was unambiguous: the resilient wheel design, while meeting applicable standards at the time of its introduction, had proven inadequate for high-speed service due to its susceptibility to fatigue cracking and the difficulty of detecting such cracks during routine inspection. The report found fault with Deutsche Bahn's failure to implement enhanced inspection procedures appropriate for the new wheel design and its failure to adequately respond to warning signs from incidents elsewhere. The report stopped short of assigning criminal blame to individuals but made clear that systemic failures across the organization had contributed to the disaster. Today, more than 2 decades after Eschede, the railway safety improvements implemented in response continue to protect passengers. The disaster's lessons have been incorporated into international railway safety standards and engineering curricula. Every high-speed train operating in Europe today is safer because of reforms prompted by Eschede. The 101 people who died that June day did not die in vain if their deaths prompted changes that have prevented other disasters and saved other lives. The ICE trains continue to operate today, still Germany's flagship railway service, still among the fastest and most advanced trains in Europe. But they do so with monoblock wheels, with enhanced inspection protocols, with safety management systems that learn from incidents and near misses, with a culture that takes warnings seriously and acts conservatively when safety questions arise. The trains are slower than they might be with more aggressive designs, but they're also safer. That trade-off, accepting slightly reduced performance in exchange for enhanced safety margins, reflects the core lesson of Eschede. For the people of Germany, Eschede remains a painful memory, a reminder that even advanced technology and rigorous engineering can fail catastrophically when design vulnerabilities intersect with inadequate oversight. The disaster damaged national pride in German engineering excellence, but the comprehensive response and reforms ultimately demonstrated the strengths of German safety culture, the willingness to acknowledge failures, learn from them, and implement fundamental changes to prevent recurrence. The memorial near the crash site is visited by thousands of people each year: railway professionals, engineering students, survivors, families, and citizens who come to remember and reflect. It stands as a permanent reminder of what was lost and what was learned. The names of 101 people are inscribed there, people who left home that morning of June 3, 1998, expecting a routine train journey and who never arrived at their destinations. Their deaths forced a reckoning with the limits of engineering confidence and the imperative of conservative safety practices in systems where failure means mass casualties. The story of Eschede is ultimately about the gap between design expectations and operational reality, about how components that perform well in testing can develop unforeseen vulnerabilities in long-term service, about how warning signs can be missed or dismissed when they don't fit existing mental models, about how disasters that seem sudden are often the culmination of years of small decisions and missed opportunities for correction. It's a story that engineers and safety professionals continue to study because its lessons remain relevant wherever complex technological systems operate at the margins of performance and safety.